Hi, and welcome once again to Raising Questions. I'm Dean, and this episode is going to be probably the least organized of them all, which is really saying something. I apologize in advance. What I'm going to do is go through a stack of stuff here, because I have no original thoughts today, and then go through a book here. Not all of it, and that will bridge the gap between this pile and this pile. This pile is about the world. This pile is about what we can do about it as individuals. That's my question right at the moment. At the moment, I'm feeling totally out of control. There is no way that I feel like I can relate to the world in a way where I think the world is actually listening. I grew up with probably a lot of pretentious dreams about having a certain impact on the world. A lot of us do, of course, and when we're in college, we're pretty well convinced we're either going to be rich and famous and influential, or we're going to be a lawyer that, well, is rich and famous and influential, or a doctor who cures all kinds of diseases. And then as you go on, you realize, wait a minute, not all of that is going to happen. So you start out as a baby, knowing nothing, but relating to the world pretty well. It's a magical place. And then the whole world teaches you, well, you got to give up some of this stuff here that you have in you and get disciplined and go to school and do real well, and you'll be rich and famous and influential. And then later on, you can worry about your own personal stuff. And that seems to be sort of the arc of life. And right now, I and some of my friends are going through that arc and saying, why? What is really going on? All right, now, here's a magazine that I subscribe to called The Week. And I was just flipping through this, reading casually with glasses on so that I could actually read it. And one of the first things I discovered this week is, according to the editor, William Falk, the situation for baby boomers, which I am basically, I just missed it by an hour and a half. Baby boomers are really, talk about influential. This is really surprising. Thanks to the sheer number of baby boomers, about 74 million out of 320 million, so around a fourth of the country, we have growing longevity and more money than young people. And here's something almost surprising. Baby boomers vote at far higher rates than young people do. And for people in my situation, that is almost surprising. I mean, I knew most of that, but it's surprising in a way, because as you go through life, as you go through the day, nowadays we're surrounded by people who are always on their iPhone, Q phone, et cetera, and relating to the phone and other so-called devices a lot more than they do to actual human beings. And you see the influence of these people, many millions of whom, and maybe even most of whom, are, let's say, younger than the average age. Younger people today live in that world, that video world, you might say. As somebody else said, the media, those media no longer reflect the environment. Those media do not reflect the environment, they are the environment. Boy, what a sad thing. So you see young mothers even at cafes sitting across from their 5-year-olds, and mom is on her device, and the 5-year-old is left to figure out the world with their own device. I really wonder what kind of effect that is having. And it was encouraging to read in this article, at least, that actually baby boomers, who are ancient by comparison, have more influence economically and in other ways than these younger people do. That's a really fascinating thing. There's a lot of contrast there and a lot of potential conflict. All right, what else is in the week? The rise of white supremacist terrorism. We know that in New Zealand, a crazy Australian killed 50 people of another religion than his, and New Zealand reacted in a way that America can surely learn from. The Prime Minister of New Zealand said, guess what? In 10 days, we're going to have new gun laws. Australia did the same thing about 20 or 30 years ago when there was a mass killing there. The United States, oh, Second Amendment all the way. Very, very sick. And one problem with our current problem, one problem with our current problem, the president, is that the current problem, the president, is a slavish devotee of the Second Amendment. When are we going to learn? So again, now this is going through me as I read this magazine, and another problem with the current problem and the current president and the current administration appears to be reflected in another article about Boeing's Max 8 airplanes that crashed, possibly because the pilots in the airplanes had not been trained correctly, and the airplanes did not have software that corrected a fatal flaw in the airplanes. And it may be that that happened because who checked out these airplanes before they were sold? The government, the FAA? Well, not entirely. To a large extent, Boeing did it. The government said, you take care of that, and then we'll put a stamp, a seal of approval on it. Very sick, not good at all. Now, again, taking another look at the world, another sad thing here is a huge flood after a storm in South Africa, Southern Africa, where thousands and thousands of people are suffering a lot more than we do in the United States, at least right at the moment. And it just makes you wonder, what can we do? Can we do anything through the political system anywhere to solve problems like that? Well, you pick up Foreign Affairs and you get some answer. Foreign Affairs is one of the really interesting magazines, in my opinion. It's all about foreign affairs. And there's an article in this particular edition, which is really recent, that said it's an interesting thing how the world is changing after World War II. And even before that, it changed a lot after World War I, and it changed a lot recently in a direct line of change from World War I through World War II that's affecting us all now, and not just in terms of foreign affairs. This is a really interesting situation here. I don't know if it answers a lot of questions about life, but this guy points out after World War I, which was basically a European war, things got straight for a while after the war. The president, Wilson, tried to start a United Nations type organization called the League of Nations. It did get started and it failed to keep order. Then after World War II, FDR and Truman, FDR during the war and Truman after the war, started another organization, the United Nations, and that has worked a lot better. But the original dream failed to come true, and we're still interested in that. We're still suffering from it a little bit. The original dream was that you'd have everybody, all the countries in the world, in the United Nations, and they would get along. You know, they'd meet in teams and committees and this, that, and the other thing. And the United States, Russia, France, and England would basically enforce the rules. China also would enforce the rules, and everybody'd be happy. We all know what happened. The Russians played hardball. They did not cooperate. They were worried a lot about the upcoming German problem. The Germans had just invaded them and slaughtered about 40 million or so Russians. Unbelievable. And because of that kind of thing, the United Nations did not work. And so Truman did a 180 and said, let's concentrate less on the whole world at large in one organization and concentrate instead on a new treaty, a treaty that will bind together the countries of the North Atlantic on both sides. Brilliantly, it was called the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, or NATO. Now, that's a real source of worry. This is actually something I actually feel confident and competent about. I feel that way. It may not be true, but I agree with the Foreign Affairs author who said that this new organization or this new world order that we have after the Second World War has cracked apart. We were supposed to have a United Nations, everybody in one big happy family. That hasn't happened, and the United States started, along with its European allies and its former enemy, Germany, NATO. Well, so what? Why is that so interesting? It's interesting because the world changed, even though NATO still exists 70 years or so after it was founded, and that's all well and good, but the situation has changed a lot in ways that actually will now affect our individual lives in the United States. It's a really interesting thing. NATO existed and everybody in it was very prosperous. Even the Germans, who had been leveled, became extremely prosperous. And then, for reasons best known to themselves, I think, people like George Bush Sr. decided to extend that order out to the Middle East. He was not really the first guy to do it, but you may remember the Berlin Wall fell. NATO was still around, very much so, and included both halves of Germany. And Bush Sr., less than brilliantly, in my opinion, pulled a lot of American troops out of Germany, where they'd been stationed to support NATO, and to make sure that Germany was always a nice, peaceful member of the alliance. Well, he spotted a problem, he thought, Senior Bush that is, in Kuwait, which we know is the place where democracy was born, and it is one of the most democratic nations on earth. And it was under threat from Saddam Hussein, and Senior Bush said, well, we've got to rescue these Kuwaitis. You know, all the founding fathers came from Kuwait. Those are great people. We got to rescue them. And he, as far as I know, he pulled troops out of Europe and sent them off to Kuwait in this great big spectacular war that lasted about 2.5 hours, and started a chain of events that has ruined a lot of predictions for peace and order and stability ever since then. His son, I think his official name is George W. Bush, his son expanded on what his father had done, and he decided, let's send even more people to the Middle East, and we are still suffering from that. Why do I say that's actually affecting us? Back in Europe, in NATO, the NATO countries agreed to stick with us against the Russians, and even in places like Afghanistan, if we would go along with the idea that they would not be totally capitalistic countries like America almost is. The European countries, when they got into NATO, insisted we're going to have a social safety net. Now, the United States is overstretched. We're in the Middle East, we're in the Far East, we're on Mars. We will soon have military bases on Jupiter if the current situation or line of development goes on. What I'm worried about is, what about the situation here at home? Now I sound like the current president, who says, let's make America great again. Now that's probably a stupid slogan in his own mind. I don't agree with him about anything that he does, or almost anything. But he is onto something. We have to make sure that other countries abroad, European allies included, start contributing to defense. According to this Foreign Affairs article, the United States spends 3 out of 4 of all the dollars spent around the world that are spent on defense, on the military. It's idiotic. I used to work for the military for a number of years, almost a decade, and I noticed, boy, it's not all suffering. I loved the people in the military. They were great people. And what a world they had, in Germany at least. The PX cut prices on everything you can name, better than Kmart, better than Walmart. Commissary, cut rate food, free medical care, low price groceries, I said food already, and so forth and so on. And in effect, in other words, they were living in a bubble where the government, their employer, took very good care of them. They lived in socialism. Don't tell anyone. The American military are the only Americans who get to live in socialism. And their presidents send them abroad to fight. You've got it. Socialism. So eventually, what's going to happen, and I'm leaving out a lot of steps here, is that people are going to catch on in the States. People probably have already started to catch on, especially people who aren't making it economically as much as they want to. The United States government is still blowing an awful lot of money on the military and on foreign adventures, rather than on safety nets for people right here. And you can throw in the immigration argument there too, as a matter of fact. All right, I'm almost through. There's only one thing to say. This is a book about the mental health of our leaders. So far, what I've said today is that I can't figure life out, so since I can't figure my life out, I'll just figure out how to rule the world and rely on guys who write for Foreign Affairs and so forth. Here's a guy, Nasir Ghami, Ghaemi, who wrote a famous book, First Rate Madness. And what's this about? This is a composite of a bunch of leaders. I don't know exactly who they are. I haven't memorized that. But I've read part of the book, and I've read other books similar to this that really make wonderful claims. If you don't feel like you're in total charge of your mind, if you feel a little nuts, this is a really great book to read. Here's something from a famous political commentator that starts out the book. Why is it that all those who have become above average, either in philosophy, politics, poetry, or the arts, seem to be melancholy, and some to such an extent that they're even seized by the diseases of black bile, depression? Now, the guy who said that was Aristotle. So the idea has been around for a long time that excellent political leaders are a little bit crazy. Here's one reason. The typical leader in a country that's not in a crisis, the typical peacetime leader, according to the author, is idealistic, very optimistic about the world, and doesn't really relate real well to other people because he's had such an easy life and because he's not living in tough times. So what is the point? The point is that the people who can save us maybe are a little bit on the crazy side, or at least depressed. Depression is an interesting thing. I've been in it myself. And depression can make a person actually more realistic and less given to wild-eyed schemes. Winston Churchill basically saved the world during World War II. He woke up drinking, did lunch drinking, supper drinking, and went to bed drinking. He was clearly an alcoholic who could definitely handle his liquor. And he had other problems. A lot of people say he was extremely depressed. He got us through the war. Maybe we need a leader like that, somebody who's not very normal. Wait a minute. Maybe we have one. So the question is, this is a good way to end the show probably, is our current leader crazy in the right way? He is doing a few things, don't tell anybody that I said this, he is doing a few things right. He's upsetting NATO quite a lot. He said, either you guys start paying for your own defense, or I'm not too sure we'll come to your rescue if you get into trouble. Magnificent. It's about time that the people in America who struggle so much compared to the average person in Europe who lives in wonderful prosperity and in a very aesthetic background with security for all of their life. It's about time that maybe a crazy leader came along and said something to ruffle the feathers of all sorts of people abroad. So we'll go into that again. And if you have any ideas about how to solve the problems in my personal life, please get a hold of me, or otherwise send in some political ideas. Thanks again for tuning in.